Hello and welcome to episode 83 of the Berean Manifesto, brought to you by the Ekklesian House. This is Pastor Bill, and this is the third part of our Killing Giants and Taking Names series, where we are going to talk about the next 10 minutes or so to take a look at when you're dragging away heads. In part one of this series, we talked about being called to something and life going on as normal while you wait for your calling to come to pass. In part two, we talked about taking that first step towards stepping into your calling, the effect that can have on the people around you that are afraid to face the challenge of your calling, and that you have to define your own way to fulfill your calling, regardless of the way others with your calling have done things in the past. In this episode, we pick up where we left off David, in the wadi, picking out 5 smooth stones. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, starting in verse 45, David said to the Philistine, "Goliath, I'm here to chew tar and kill giants, and I'm all out of tar." No, seriously. He said, "You come against me with a sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of Armies, the God of the ranks of Israel. You have defied him. Today, the Lord will hand you over to me. Today, I'll strike you down, remove your head, and give the corpses of the Philistine camp to the birds of the sky and the wild creatures of the earth. Then all the world will know that Israel has a God, and this whole assembly will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's. He will hand you over to us." There's this confidence that David has here that doesn't make any natural sense. Goliath is coming at him with a sword, spear, and javelin. All David has is 5 stones, a bag, and a sling. That confidence is the confidence of walking in the Lord's calling on your life. It is of no consequence what tools the enemy brings against you, or even the tools that others of your calling use. If those were the tools you were supposed to have, the tools that your enemy is using, the tools that others in your calling are using, if those were the tools you were supposed to have at this time, then you would already have them. The perfect tools for the job you have at hand are the tools you have at hand. Do the best you can with the best you have, and let God have everything else. This is what David does. Goliath runs toward David, and in response, David rushes to the battle line to face him. David reaches into his bag, takes out 1 stone, and using his sling, launches it right into Goliath's forehead. Goliath is dead. The Israelites and Philistines watch in what I assume was this super tense silence as David approaches Goliath's body. He takes Goliath's sword from its sheath. It was probably so quiet that you could hear the scraping of the metal echo back and forth as he takes that sword out. And he begins to cut Goliath's head off. Before we go on, I want you to really get that picture in your head. Goliath was over 9 feet tall, and David was between 11 and 13 years old. Goliath's sword was probably longer than David was tall and just as heavy as David. No matter how strong David was, This was a feat of incredible strength. Not to mention that this wouldn't have been an easy thing to do. David would have had to struggle, and he would have been covered from head to toe in yuck. Following through on taking that first step into your calling will most likely get dirty. You're going to have to roll your sleeves up and hustle to see results. No one's going to hand your calling to you on a silver platter. It's at this point that it's finally sunk in for the Israelites and the Philistines. The Philistines flee, and the Israelites pursue them over 10 miles to the gates of Ekron. It wasn't enough for either army to see Goliath get hit in the head by the stone. It wasn't enough for either army to see Goliath then fall flat on his face. It wasn't enough for either army to see Goliath not get back up as David approached his body and took his sword. They all, allies and enemy, needed more proof before they would believe that David had succeeded, before they would act. Until you've taken that sword and sliced into the neck of that giant, enemy and ally alike will continue to doubt your ability to pull off the feats of your calling. And you won't know how far out that moment is, and you won't see it coming when it happens. You just have to stay faithful to your hustle in your calling until those around you begin to respond. On the way back, the Israelites plundered the camps of the Philistines, taking everything they left behind for themselves. They joined David in his quest toward his calling, and they reaped the benefits of that success. David then takes Goliath's head to Jerusalem. It's a curious thing for him to do, to take the head of Goliath to a city that the Israelites don't even own at this point. The Jebusites were still inhabiting Jerusalem at that point, and the city wouldn't even belong to the Israelites until David, in his first official act as king, storms the city in 2 Samuel chapter 5. In episode 77, we talked about Abraham having taken Isaac up on Mount Moriah to sacrifice him to the Lord, and God stopping him and providing a ram instead. It was on this spot that Jerusalem sat. It was this spot that the Lord had designated for the sacrifices for sin. If you ask me, David brought Goliath's head to Jerusalem to offer it to God as a first fruit offering. You have to remember that David has had hours upon hours of time alone with his thoughts. While playing the lyre to soothe Saul's soul, he's alone with his thoughts. While out in the field taking care of his father's sheep, he's alone with his thoughts. David has had plenty of time to work out why Saul has been rejected by God as king, a detail that the public at large still has no idea of. David seems to have worked it out, and in his first move towards stepping into his calling, David is setting a standard and sending a clear message that he understands whose anointing he will be walking in as king. He understands that God put this calling on his life. God anointed him to be king, and it's God's agenda that David will follow. He also understands that just as God placed David in this calling and gave him this anointing, God can also take it away, like he did with Saul. Though David did eventually become king, it wasn't until he was 30 years old. That's right. David continued in this place of called, anointed, and waiting to fully step into his calling for about 22 years. I did say Goliath was just David's first step toward his calling. That wraps up part 3 of this 3-part series. Make sure you check back in next week for the 4th and final installment of Killing Giants and Taking Names. It's the epilogue, the epilogue of the series. When you're not the one who is called. This is Pastor Bill saying, until next time.